Anyway, so yeah, without further ado, I'd love to get started. Hi to everybody who's online. I can't see you, but thank you for joining us on Zoom. So as you all know, this is a bit of an unusual hybrid seminar. We've never done this before, where we've had somebody, an online speaker, but then people in person. So kind of trying to do the best of all the worlds, I guess. I just want to say that this is a global development seminar for our department. It's also organized by our wonderful grad students from the Development Studies PhD program, Sydney and Tamar, who did most of the organizing work for this, as they have for all the seminars this year. And this is the first time we've actually co-hosted, co-sponsored something with the Qualitative Research Institute of Cornell Center for Social Science, which is a fantastic arm of the Center for Social Science. Is Lee here? Lee Humphrey? No, not here. Lee's here. You're Lee.
I am.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I just said is Lee here. I was just saying thank you to the Qualitative Research Institute for co-sponsoring this.
To be able to co-sponsor
Yes,
exactly. And I'm so excited.
Yes, thank you. That's all we needed. Anyway, yes, so they are co-sponsoring this, which is fantastic. And we've never done a joint event. So thank you if you're coming via those channels or from the Department of Communication. And anything else I wanted to say before I introduce her? Oh, for the Q&A at the end, I think because of the sound, it's really hard if you're online to hear people sitting out here in the room. So either you can come up here to ask your question, or maybe I can stand up here and repeat questions for you. We'll attempt that and see. I am not manning the Zoom chat, so I don't know, maybe if somebody has a computer and wants to do that, yeah, tomorrow, Sydney, you guys could do that because I don't have it open. And yeah, that's all the technical stuff. So without further ado, we are really happy to have Dr. Ashley Rubin with us today. She's an associate professor at the University of Hawaii. She just informed me it's 70s and sunny, if anyone wants to know the weather report from Hawaii. No comments, no comments. Ashley did her PhD in social policy and jurisprudence, is that right, at Berkeley? And most of her work has been on issues of crime within sociology and also corporal punishment, which is fascinating. The reason I had heard of Ashley's work is because I teach her book in my Qualitative Methods PhD seminar. It came out about 1.5 years ago, I think, right? So I was able to use it last spring semester for the first time, and we're reading it again this semester, and it's been fantastic to have that as a kind of like handbook. Hate to say the word textbook, it's definitely not a textbook, but we're kind of using it as a textbook for qualitative methods. So yeah, we connected on Twitter, I think, and I was like, oh, what a great idea to have her come. And I think most of the class, my qualitative methods class, is here, so they have been reading your book. Other people who read it last year are also here. So anyway, it's a nice group from the Qualitative Social Sciences. So anyway, I'll turn it over to you, Ashley. Thanks again for joining us today.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction and for organizing and dealing with the hybrid event and all of that. And thank you so much to Sydney and Tamar for also organizing kind of behind the scenes. And thank you, of course, to everyone who is either tuning in through online or who is has made their way through the cold and potentially the snow to be there in person. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get that going. Okay, great. So I'm going to dive right in with what I want to accomplish today. So my kind of main priorities are, I want to tell you about why I wrote the book and what I'm hoping to accomplish with the book. And as part of that, I want to introduce what I call the dirtbagging approach to qualitative social science, because that's kind of I would say, one of the key contributions of the book. But before I get into that, I want to talk just a little bit about qualitative methods generally at kind of a starting point. So first, I want to acknowledge that this has been a wonderful time for qualitative methods lately. There have been a number of books that have come out right around the same time as my book. So I have a lot of competitors, but they're really wonderful books. This isn't even a comprehensive list. I think there are a couple of others that I didn't get on here. But just there's a lot of interest in qualitative methods. And this is just a wonderful time of people breaking down qualitative methods. So if you don't like my approach, there are other approaches to go to. And I think that's really the key for methods, is just finding, the approach, the type of guy that you like, and especially for the type of work that you're doing. And more generally, I think it's always good to just get a lot of different perspectives on qualitative methods. And that's kind of one of the themes you'll see come up today. Okay, so I'm talking about qualitative methods, but I want to start by actually defining qualitative methods, because there's a lot of misconceptions about qualitative methods and also a lot of definitions that I find misleading, to put it nicely, and sometimes just wrong, to put it less nicely. And so when I'm defining qualitative methods, I like to distinguish between methods of data collection and methods of data analysis. So when we're talking about methods of data collection, some of the most common types of qualitative methods of data collection include things like interviews and focus groups, ethnography and participant observation, as well as analyzing text, whether that's going through Reddit threads or going to an archive, or these days you can go to online archives and download your archival material that's been scanned and that sort of thing. So we have a lot of different methods of data collection. And then as we're collecting our data, going through and collecting our texts or doing our interviews or doing our ethnography, we generate a lot of qualitative data. So these might be interview transcripts, ethnographic field notes, as well as either digital or archival texts. And these are our data. And then we can either analyze these qualitatively or quantitatively. And of course, with mixed methods too, but I find it's helpful to kind of just distinguish between the two for the sake of presentation kind of clarity, hopefully. Okay, so we have this data that we can analyze either way. So that brings us to data analysis. So when I define qualitative methods, I tend to focus on the methods of data analysis rather than the data collection part, because it can kind of branch off in those directions. And I offer an incredibly broad definition that is by no means typical. As I said, there are a lot of definitions out there, but this is the definition that I like to use for qualitative methods of data analysis. So I define it, again, very broadly, as any systematic analysis of data, excluding tests of significance. So basically, if you're doing, t-tests or you're doing a regression, like whatever type of regression, by definition, I just exclude those. Those are very clearly quantitative methods. But anything basically up to that point, as long as it's systematic and as long as it's data-driven, I'm going to define that as qualitative methods. So this is very much on purpose an expansive big tent definition. I want to fit everyone doing qualitative methods in here. That said, I'm also purposely trying to exclude certain types of research that I would not define as qualitative methods, some of which are sometimes mistakenly included as qualitative methods and others that are not. So as you see, like by definition, I'm literally excluding quantitative methods. I think that's pretty fair. But there's also this idea of pure theory. So sometimes when we're reading kind of purely theoretical text, they might have examples that are like data-driven examples, but they're kind of used illustratively, but they're not really systematically collected or systematically analyzed. They're really just there to kind of illustrate things. I'm also distinguishing qualitative data analysis from what we might call advocacy. So you might think about like what people do in the legal sphere, so like lawyers, or more generally, somebody who is trying to kind of prove a point, and they only present the data or the evidence that's going to help support their case, which is not systematic because you're purposefully excluding anything that kind of weakens your case. So just like if you're a lawyer defending your client, you want to put your best evidence forward and kind of sweep anything else under the carpet or find a way to argue against any alternative evidence. And that's not what we're doing with qualitative methods. And I think it's really important to make that distinction, because sometimes that's not always clear to everyone. Now, of course, as I said before, we can always combine qualitative methods. We can do mixed methods. We can combine qualitative methods with advocacy. We can combine qualitative methods with pure theory. There gets more like just very theoretical qualitative methods. And you can, of course, combine qualitative and quantitative methods. So there's always different types, but just for the sake of definitions, I like to keep things as pure as possible, just so that we have that clarity. Okay, so now I want to get into why I wrote the book and what I'm trying to accomplish. Okay, so this book grew out of this deep frustration that I had over the years, especially my time on the tenure track, where I just kept getting frustrated with a number of situations. One was I kept kind of hearing faculty either in job talks or in mock talks or like giving grad students advice, but just a number of different situations where senior faculty or even not so senior faculty would give really well-meaning advice to, especially to grad students or junior faculty, but it didn't quite fit the research project that they were doing. So a lot of times it would be somebody coming from a quantitative perspective or just a different type of qualitative perspective than what the student was trying to do. And at the time, I would hear this and I would think, no, but that's wrong. And I couldn't say why it was wrong. I didn't have the one, the confidence, but two, the kind of the way to articulate what was going on, why I kind of had this feeling of, no, that's the wrong advice for this type of project, and I just can't articulate it. So that was one set of frustration. The other one was I taught qualitative methods in both the criminology department and a sociology department. Both were very interdisciplinary. So I perfectly curated this syllabus of all these great texts, of the texts, the chapters, the books that I found to be like just the perfect pieces on qualitative methods. And it was a nice interdisciplinary kind of syllabus drawing on political science, sociology, the interdisciplinary field of law and society, some stuff from history and so on. I think I even included an econometrics text in there on research design because they're really good on that. And so I had this really nice syllabus, but I found myself kind of explaining to the class, okay, so this is a really good point, but it's also, you know, one way of doing things. This isn't the only way of doing things, because the text that I was assigning, they kept saying, this is how you do the qualitative research. This is the right way to do it. Here's the formula, here's the method, here's the technique, whatever it is, here's the way to do it. And all other approaches are wrong. And since I was teaching this, this very interdisciplinary class, I'd, you know, point out, you know, this text says this is the right way, but this other text says this is the right way. So clearly they can't all be right. Like, that's pretty self-evident. So I would kind of find myself offering caveats or generally arguing with the text, trying to contextualize things for my students. And the funny thing is I was doing this even with the texts that were supposed to be kind of radical, the ones that were rejecting the so-called kind of canonical approach, or rejecting the kind of let's just transplant quantitative logic into qualitative research, and different ways that people were doing that, and just kind of saying like, you know, no, even this so-called radical text, like it's still kind of conservative when it comes to methods. So like, what's going on here? And so eventually I started to figure out what was going on, that basically there's this kind of consensus. It's kind of weird to call it a consensus, but essentially there's a consensus that there's one right way of doing research, and it's usually a very rigid way. And of course, the funny thing is there's multiple right ways of doing things, but you know, none of the texts are offering that, and none of the people giving the advice are kind of recognizing that it's this way. It's, you know, the way I was trained or the way that I prefer, and all other approaches are wrong. And so once I kind of started to figure out that's what's going on, I'm like, oh, okay, I think now I have the tools and the confidence to kind of step back and say, nah, that's not exactly right. Okay, so I said that there are multiple right ways that we see in the literature, but they do kind of tend to follow a fairly strong, like strict model of how to do research. So there are variations on this, but it basically, the kind of central right way, the way that I was taught in one of my many methods classes in grad school, and the way that I see most commonly represented, especially in my fields, but in others as well, is to follow essentially what we would call the scientific method. So you start with your research question. Based on your research question, you make a research design. Once that's perfected, you go out, you collect your data, then you analyze your data, and then you write and publish it up. And along the way, there are a couple of kind of strict rules that you have to follow. So one is you have a narrowly defined research question. You always hear faculty advisors say you have to narrow down that research question. It's too broad. That's too much for one semester or for a dissertation or for a paper or whatever. So narrow down that research question. And sometimes you'll hear people say your research question has to be about the relationship between two variables. Also importantly, your research question has to be motivated by the existing literature or theory, however that's defined in your field. So it has to come from basically the existing scholarship first. And as I mentioned, as part of this scientific method, you have to select your research question before you do the data collection, because the data collection have to specifically respond to your research question. That research question shapes the research design. You want that perfected before you go out and collect your data. One of the beauties of this approach is you can basically write up most of your paper, except for the findings and discussion section, before you even go out into the field and collect your data. So if you're doing grant-based research where you have to like write grant proposals, this is a wonderful approach because you can write up your grant so easily with your hypotheses and like your motivation for doing your research and so on. And you have this kind of very clear plan of what you're going to do. Okay, so So I mentioned that you do your research question, then you also have to finalize your research design. That's responding to your research question. And this has to be finalized before you go out and collect your data. And as part of your research design, there are also very specific rules for your case selection. So most, I would argue all studies have some sort of case. It's just, I define it very broadly because of course I do. So you have to have this case, but there are very specific rules for how you select that case. And there's basically this approved list of techniques that you have to follow or draw from to justify your case. So you want to get the best case that answers your research question. So that has to be selected first. Your research design has to be finalized, and then you go out and you collect your data. And then of course your data collection follows the data analysis, all very linear, all very neat, all very clean and nice. Except that's not the way that I do my research. And it's not the way that a lot of my colleagues do their research. It's not the way that a lot of my favorite research does it, and people that I respect, they do their research in a different way. So I found myself kind of bumping up against this and kind of always thinking, oh, I'm doing it wrong. Like I know like this is the way we're supposed to do it, but that's not the way I'm doing it. I felt a lot of shame about this, especially in grad school, especially as an early career faculty member, just thinking I'm doing it wrong. And over time, as I started to realize that actually there are other people doing it this way, really, really good research is doing it this way too, that made me feel a lot better. So what is this wrong way of doing it? Well, basically, we like to make a mess of the scientific method. So we're still following all the steps, we just put them in the wrong order. And you see on the diagram that I have, it's this very kind of iterative, messy process where you're kind of going back and forth. Something happens and you have to go back. Sometimes you do that on purpose, just everything is a mess. So a couple of examples of what I mean, and a couple of the rules that we're told not to violate that we violate. So probably the biggest one for me especially is choosing your research question based on your data and not based on the literature or the theory. This is a huge no-no. I was always told in grad school, you choose your research question based on the literature, based on theory, and then you go out and you collect your data or select your data, figure out your research design based on that. But instead, I kind of like to go out and see what my data are, and then I come up with a good research question or kind of narrow down my research question. So as part of that process, I like to start with a really broad research question. I want to go out and study X. So it's very broad, and a lot of times it doesn't involve the relationship between two variables. It's kind of this open-ended question of, what does this look like in this context or at this time, or just what's going on here? As part of that, a lot of times I'm drawn to an interesting case or what sometimes people call convenient cases. This is one of those terms that means so many different things to different people. So sometimes it means it's kind of a slang for it's an easy case. Sometimes it's a case that just there's a lot of data available on it. Sometimes it's a case that's literally in your own backyard. So kind of, again, going back to easy. There are a lot of different reasons or kind of meanings for that term. But basically selecting your case for reasons other than this list of like these carefully laid out explanations or justifications for why you selected your case. It's a good case. Like it's just interesting. There's something there. And I can't really explain it, but I'm just drawn to this case. Okay. And then another big rule that you're not supposed to violate, but that we violate all the time for this type of research is sampling on the dependent variable. Excellent advice not to do that for certain types of projects, but for a lot of the type of projects that I'm talking about, you kind of have to. There's no other way to do it. And so when people tell you you're not supposed to do it, it's kind of like, well, what else would I do? Like, of course I'm going to do it. Okay. So as I said, this is how I do my work. It's how a lot of people that I respect and admire do their work. It's also incidentally how most ethnographers do their work, which is like, it's an entire field that's basically been dismissed in terms of like some of the advice that you get from other fields. Even though they also incorporate ethnography, they just have different rules about going about it. So this is kind of this other way of doing research that often would get left out of the standard advice that I was assigning in my class, with the exception of the text on how to do ethnography that I was also assigning. Okay, so basically kind of carving out a space for this approach, this wrong way of doing it, what I'm calling the dirtbagging approach to social science, or the dirtbagging social scientists. That's one of the main goals of my book, is basically to kind of legitimize and lay out what this approach looks like, so that when people are told they're doing it wrong, but they're like, no, like this really makes sense for the project that I'm doing, for the type of thing that I'm doing. Like, I'm not wrong, I'm not lazy, like this really is the right way to do it. I wanted people to have a resource that they could read, that they could cite and kind of point to and say, no, this is actually an established way of doing it, especially in fields where, you don't have, for example, a lot of ethnography or ethnographers to point to and say, like, I'm basically doing what they're doing, just, maybe not with ethnography, for example. Okay. Another big goal of the book is to acknowledge that there are multiple right ways of doing qualitative methods and kind of explain what a lot of these look like. And along the way to kind of recognize that there are disciplinary and methodological variations. So you might have kind of different flavors or different approaches depending on if you're doing a purely interview-based study or a purely ethnography study or a purely historical kind of text-based study. So you might have kind of different flavors, but there are these multiple right ways. Now, I do want to caveat, there are definitely wrong ways. Like, I don't want to say that anything goes, but rather to kind of recognize what are those right ways so that people kind of can be a little bit more pluralistic when they're kind of reading about scholarship, watching a research talk, advising students, and so on. As part of the book, I also wanted this to be something that people could use in their classes. And I love hearing it when people are actually assigning this and using it in their classes. That's really awesome. So as part of the book, I also wanted to provide kind of what I think of as a cradle to grave overview of how to do qualitative methods well. The original version of this book had a whole 2 additional chapters on writing things up, as well as a chapter on like dealing with the anxiety of doing a lot of this stuff. But the book was getting pretty long, I guess, for books these days. Like back in the day, you could do much longer books, but now we have to make our books as small as possible. So I had to cut the writing section, but that's coming out in book 2, which is next on my list of writing projects. But basically, the goal is to give this overview of how do you do qualitative methods and how do you do it well. And as part of that idea of how do you do it well, I'm also including advice about how to defend your work against both legitimate and illegitimate criticism. And what I mean by that is I don't want people to go out and do their research, have a finished project, go and present it, and then have somebody give them a legitimate criticism. And they're like, oh, damn, you're right. I shouldn't have done it. That was wrong. Like, how did I not see that before? So I want to kind of lay out what are some of the pitfalls and things to kind of look out for. But I'm also trying to give people the tools to defend their work against what I would call illegitimate criticism. The comments like, don't sample an independent variable, and how to say like, actually, for this type of project, that does make sense. And so kind of laying out and modeling different responses to some of the standard criticisms that we sometimes get so that we kind of, are aware of that, like, oh, your sample size is too small and things like that of like, well, sometimes your sample size is too small, but other times people are just saying that just as a kind of gut reaction to seeing qualitative research. So how to respond to that in a, useful, practical, and professional way. Okay. As part of this kind of overview, I also wanted to help people kind of work through, kind of acknowledge and work through the anxiety that comes with doing qualitative research. So it's funny because when we're teaching quantitative research and, statistics and all that, we're kind of used to seeing anxiety about that. So literally this is studied. There's a whole field on, there's like a whole set of research on math anxiety and statistics anxiety or quantitative research anxiety. We don't really talk about the anxiety that comes with qualitative methods, I think in part because people think qualitative methods are just easy, but there's a lot of aspects of every part of academia, from like grad school to being faculty, postdoc, precarious labor, all of that, and especially the research stage of doing research and research and writing that we don't, I think, talk about enough. So I really wanted to acknowledge, like, there are parts of this, sometimes the entire thing, that's just really anxiety provoking. And so if you feel that anxiety, it's okay. Like, it's not just you, like that's very common. I share a lot about my anxieties from different projects throughout the book. And just kind of recognize that, yeah, like that's a thing. And here are some of the tricks for how to deal with it. And sometimes the trick is just get through, and that's the trick basically. Okay. But again, even though this is a cradle to grave overview, I want to emphasize this is not supposed to be the first and last book you read on methods. I'm a big fan of methods training. I think everyone in grad school should take as many methods classes as you can. Quantitative, qualitative, research design, like everything. If you can go outside of your department and kind of see how methods are taught in other departments, I think that's a great thing to do. That's always my number one advice to students, is just really bone up on your methods training, because once you graduate, you're kind of on your own and you have to pick the stuff up on your own. And it's a lot harder to do that when you don't have somebody kind of holding your hand and walking your way through it, as you hopefully often have in actual methods courses. And as I said, there are a lot of really good books and they all have different perspectives. And I think it's really important to kind of recognize those different perspectives. And I, again, try to do that in the book, but the best way to do it is to go out and read all of those books. But recognizing that everybody doesn't have infinite time on their hands to read every book out there, I'm hoping the book does like a good job of kind of giving you a sense of some of the flavors out there, so that you can be a little bit strategic in which ones you do kind of go and investigate after that. Okay. And finally, one of my goals for the book is to kind of, I try to write it kind of thinking as the book would serve as a pocket mentor for people. So, you know, we all hope that students and junior faculty have a good mentor, but we also know that's not always the case. And so I wanted this book to be kind of this reassuring kind of support for people who are doing research at whatever stage they're in, frankly, and can kind of give people advice, that support, that reassurance, but also tell the hard truths is like, no, you really do have to do this thing. Like, again, research isn't a free for all. There's some things where we can be really flexible, but other things where we kind of have to batten down the hatches and do it a particular way. So like, what are those things? What are the pitfalls? What do we have to be careful about? But doing it in a very supportive way as much as possible. Okay, some other bits about how I go about it. So the book is written in this very informal tone. It's written in the first person. I swear a lot in the book. I had to tone that down repeatedly over the various drafts. At one point, they wanted me to cut it completely. I was like, no, research is stressful, so I'm going to swear. So that's in there. So, you know, word of warning if that's not your thing. I also explicitly tried to write the book with the kind of goal of having this written for a broad array of methods. So whether you're doing interviews, ethnography, or text-based research, or some combination of those or others, these are just the most common, I wanted this book to be useful. I was especially kind of emphasizing the historical stuff because there's so little written about social science or in social science qualitative methods on historical and archival research. Usually they're kind of separated texts, but they're usually explicitly let out because the main focus is on interviews or ethnography. So I wanted to make sure that kind of there's plenty of advice for people doing historical research. It's also my favorite type of research, so I was a little biased there. But I'm trying to generalize across the methods and kind of show what we have in common, even if we're using different techniques of data collection. I also tried to write the book with a lot of different examples, but also recurring examples. So one of my frustrations with existing methods texts is so often you'll get kind of one example and then move on, but I'll still be like, oh, I don't quite understand what's going on here. Like I would really benefit from another example. So I tried to include multiple examples, but I also didn't want to overwhelm people because my other criticism of existing texts is you'll just get overwhelmed with the number of examples where it's this study and then that study and that study and that study. And it gets to be a lot. So I try to kind of have a number of examples kind of throughout the book that repeat, and I kind of give a little refresher each time. So it's hopefully kind of, you remember which example I'm talking about, which book or which article. But basically it's a little hopefully reassuring because you keep getting those same examples. As part of these, I also include my own personal experience doing research and drawing on my own research, in part so you can kind of get an inside look, because while some projects, like authors are really good about kind of sharing some of the behind the scenes, but not always. And so I wanted to make sure that I could kind of share that. And I knew my experiences really well, whereas I don't always know other people's experiences. And even when I do, I didn't really feel comfortable sharing some people's experiences. Kind of, it just felt weird and icky. So I use my own experiences for that. So hopefully that's useful. And then finally, I'm drawing on a lot of different kind of pre-existing methods texts. And I'm doing this, again, just like my syllabus for my qualitative methods class, drawing on a lot of different fields. So from political science, sociology, history, econometrics, different fields like that, and from a lot of different interdisciplinary fields as well. So very much this book is drawing on other people's insights. So like there's a lot there that's kind of already out there in the literature. I'm just kind of bringing it together kind of under one roof, basically. And also trying to show the diversity of approaches to doing qualitative methods. But very much this is building on other people's work. Okay, and my favorite part about the book is I use this motif of rock climbing throughout the book because I find rock climbing to be this really interesting field, both as a practice and to just like study it because it's really fascinating as a social phenomenon. But in particular, I find it just really inspirational, and I love the camaraderie of rock climbers and how they kind of cheer each other on. There are all these like fun stories and just wonderful metaphors that really helped me to flesh out some of what I was trying to explain in a different kind of hopefully easier way than some of the research examples. And I want to flag here, I am absolutely riffing on Krista Luker's book, Salsa Dancing Through the Social Sciences, where she uses salsa dancing as the major motif of her book. And so I'm very much copying from her in doing this. Okay, so what are some of the kind of contributions of rock climbing to my book, and what are the things that I'm kind of taking from the field of rock climbing? So one is this way in which rock climbers are just so optimistic and are just completely visionary about how they're doing things. So kind of the canonical example that I'm thinking of for rock climbers, especially these early kind of 1950s, 1960s, there at the time it was basically all guys as far as I know, but these guys basically at the bottom of a mountain kind of looking at this massive wall of granite and thinking, I'm gonna get to the top of that. I don't know how I'm gonna do that, but I'm gonna get to the top of that. My kind of the challenge is just figuring out how to do it and then actually doing it. And I feel like that's true of a lot of our research projects, where we have this project where like, here's that thing I want to do. I want to go out and study this. Don't really know how I'm going to do it. I just have to figure out how I'm going to do it and then, do it. But that's basically the trick. So just figuring out that's kind of the hard part of, okay, I know what I'm trying to do, but how am I going to do it? So, and there's some kind of aspects of rock climbing that I draw on kind of to deal with some of that I'll come back to in just a moment. The other thing that I really like about rock climbing is that there are a lot of different ways to do rock climbing. So kind of moving beyond the fact that there are different disciplines of climbing. So like there's alpinism, where like you're climbing Everest. There's bouldering, which is like you climb up, say 10 or 12 feet in the air with no rope. And there are different styles of kind of rock-based climbing and all that. But even putting that aside, different climbers can climb the same mountain in a lot of different ways, but they can even climb the same route in different ways. And a lot of this comes down to things like different body size, different flexibility. Some people are really tall, and that makes certain moves easier. Some people are just incredibly gymnastic and can kind of get their body in different like ways. Some people have like different strengths, so like either upper body strength or lower body strength. And then finally, it just kind of comes down to personality and preference. So you have all these different ways in which people can climb a route. And I see that happening with qualitative methods too, where we can have like two of us can go out and say like, I have the same project in mind, but we would go about it differently. And that doesn't make our projects kind of one worse than the other. It's just a different way of going about it. Like I might want to highlight this variable. I might want to use this lens. I might want to use like say ethnography, and somebody else wants to do interviews, but we're going to approach it in these different ways. And that's okay, because there's no one right way to do qualitative methods. And then finally, I think one of the most important aspects of rock climbing that I'm trying to emphasize as part of qualitative methods is the need for flexibility when you're doing this research. And I think this is kind of broadly true of research in general, but especially for the type of qualitative research that I'm talking about. So in rock climbing, a lot of times, so the goal for a lot of people is to do a particular climb in one go. So like, let's say you're going to climb 30 feet in the up the wall, and that's the climb, and you want to do it once. The first time you want to do it right, and that's the goal. So a lot of times people kind of map out a route. They'll see a line that they're going to follow. They kind of practice the moves and kind of like think about the body positions and kind of mime them out on the ground. And then the idea is they have that all kind of nailed down, and then they're going to go up the wall and hopefully do it in one go. But sometimes you get on the wall and you're like, oh, this is a little different than I expected. Like this hold is a little bit shallower than I expected. I can't quite do it, or I can't get my body in the right, like I can't put the weight on my toe in the right way. And you have to just basically do things differently than what you planned. Maybe you have to take a different lineup. Maybe you have to do some different moves. Sometimes you have to down climb and then kind of go around. And sometimes you have to just completely get off the climb and start again with a different plan in mind, and just kind of improvise or just, replan or something like that. And I think that's true of a lot of research, where, sometimes you got into the field and, well, that business you were going to study, it went out of business, or somebody pulled your clearance to get access to a school or something, or a global pandemic happens and you can no longer go out into the field because it's not safe for you or your participants. And basically things happen. There's so many things that happen, and you have to be flexible and improvise. And I think too often people feel ashamed about this kind of, oh, it didn't go according to plan. My research design fell apart. Something has, I have to do something differently than I set out to. And that's just really common. So I want to kind of also take away the shame that people a lot of times experience from that. Okay, so now I want to talk a bit about this kind of specific brand of qualitative research that I'm calling dirtbagging social science. Okay, so I want to explain a little bit more about rock climbing at the moment. So right now, rock climbing is having its moment. There are major feature films. Free Solo is this great documentary that won an Oscar a couple of years ago. There was another major release documentary called The Dawn Wall that you could see in theaters. I'm not sure if 14 Peaks and The Alpinist were in theaters, but part of that's also the pandemic. But basically we have like mainstream movies about climbing in this like intensity that we didn't quite have a lot of before. There has always been a couple of climbing films, but this is like a lot. Likewise, there's this major climb that was the focus of the documentary, The Dawn Wall. And it took these two guys 7 years to figure out how to do this climb and then finally to complete it. So it was this epic climb. And when they completed it, it was this major media kind of storm. And even President Obama, then President Obama, congratulated them on Twitter for climbing the Dawn Wall. Then like climbing was making its way into the Olympics. So these were eventually postponed because of COVID, but like even climbing is now an Olympic sport. So climbing is super mainstream. There are climbing gyms in like, I think every major city. They have climbing holds and like little kid gyms. So this is like a really big part of American culture these days. It wasn't always like that. So American climbing really got its start in the 1950s, 1960s, especially in Yosemite National Park, or the Valley of Yosemite National Park in California. And so this is kind of the birthplace of American rock climbing. And the men, as far as I know, they were all white men at the time. The men involved in this endeavor of kind of creating this like new sport, essentially, or this discipline of climbing, were oftentimes referred to as dirtbaggers. And that's kind of because they were seen as these kind of social miscreants. They were very much social deviants. A lot of them were unemployed. They had a very testy relationship with the park rangers there at Yosemite National Park, a lot of times like literally running from the law. So it was kind of this very countercultural group of people doing this work. And you can also think about like what 1950s, 1960s America was like at the time, you know, very Leave It to Beaver, very like buttoned up, not this kind of like hang loose, eventually like, you know, hippie lifestyle going on. So, so some more about these dirtbaggers. So as I said, they're kind of deviant, kind of countercultural, but they also did what was necessary to do the climbs that they wanted. So one of the kind of aspects of dirtbaggers is they just kind of live for their climbing and they do whatever they need to get by so that they can spend their full time climbing. I also think of these guys as especially visionary. So again, these are the men who looked at this 3,000 foot tall block of granite and said, I'm going to get up there at a time when we didn't have specialized climbing shoes. We didn't have like good rope. And basically just decided we're going to get to the top and we're going to figure it out. And they kind of figured it out on their own. And did it and just accomplished these like amazing things that are kind of hard to fathom these days. Okay, so bringing dirtbaggers to qualitative methods. So why am I calling this brand of social science dirtbagging? So I tried really hard to come up with another phrase. This idea came to me really, really early because I liked the way in which it felt deviant, because to me, a lot of this type of research that I was doing felt deviant because I was breaking all these rules. I felt very countercultural, especially in certain departments I had worked in. This was very much not the way that you're supposed to do research. But dirtbagger has kind of a connotation of, you know, like dirtbag, bad guy. And, you know, so that's kind of gross and people don't like that. Plus, like, you have to explain what dirtbagger means and all this history. So what are some other terms I could have used? So I thought about, you know, inductive as opposed to say deductive research, but I don't like making that distinction because a lot of research, especially qualitative research, but a lot of research generally is both inductive and deductive. It might be more inductive than deductive, but I don't like just saying this is inductive because, you know, there's a lot of other stuff going on. It's not just inductive in any given project typically. So same thing with theory generating. A lot of the work I'm talking about is theory generating, but a lot of times we also do theory testing as part of our theory generating research. So that seems misleading. Is it case study research? I would argue all research is case study research. So that's not really helpful. And I didn't want to kind of exclude things where people are like, oh, I'm not doing a case. So I don't want this to be something that seems overly narrow, even though I would define everything as case study. Ethnography or ethnographic. Well, a lot of the work I do, I kind of use ethnography as a model, but I'm not an ethnographer, and I'm pretty sure other ethnographers would say, yeah, you're not an ethnographer, because I do a lot of historical research. But even if I was doing interviews, that's not necessarily ethnography a lot of times. So I'm kind of using ethnography as a model, but it's supposed to be, again, broader than ethnography. Is it grounded theory? Well, there are parts of it that are grounded theory, especially a kind of more Emersonian grounded theory. So it's not really like pure grounded theory, but a kind of a modified version of it. But again, that's just like a small part of it. So there's so much more of what's going on than any of these labels. And my friends and I tried to come up with labels, and nothing we came up with would work, in part because it's kind of supposed to be this more holistic picture that's bigger than any of these individual labels. So I stuck with this idea of dirtbaggers. And what I'm trying to get across is basically it's this collection of things that we're told not to do, but they're actually the things that you're supposed to do for certain types of projects or for certain types of goals. Okay, so what are some of those things? So I think the kind of most important idea is that it's interest-driven research. So basically you start with these broad, non-specific goals. I want to go out and study X in some area, and then I'm going to figure it out from there. In terms of where literature and theory comes in, usually that's later. So you kind of go in, you're collecting your data, you're analyzing your data, and you're starting to think about how the literature or existing theory would make sense of these things, but they come in kind of after the fact. So you're not perfecting your research design until basically later. You're definitely not setting out to test hypotheses or to do theory testing, even though you might eventually add in some hypothesis testing or some theory testing. Usually your goal as part of this kind of broad, non-specific goal is just to understand some phenomenon, and you're going to figure out kind of along the way what your exact angle is, like what it is that you're really studying, but after you've kind of gone out into the field. So while you're doing your data collection, or maybe even after you've completed your data collection sometimes. So necessarily you're going to start with this very broad research question that's going to change over time. So a lot of times it's going to narrow, but sometimes it might be a completely different question by the time you're done. So the image I have here is of Everest, and this quote from George Lee Mallory, who was one of the first people to try to climb Everest and was fairly successful, but we don't really know if he actually got to the top. But he was one of the kind of major early efforts to climb Everest back in 1924, well, in the early 1920s, really. And at one point, a journalist asked him, like, why are you doing this? Why are you risking your life? And eventually he did die on Everest. And his answer to this journalist asking, like, why are you doing rock climbing? Why are you trying to climb Everest? His answer was, because it's there. And that kind of frustration with like, why are you studying this case? That kind of, I think, encapsulates a lot of the dirtbagging spirit of like, it's just an interesting case. I like it. It's like, I'm just going to study it because it's interesting. Now, of course, we know we do have to always justify our cases, and we have to kind of go through that process. But for a lot of us, especially early on, we can't really articulate what's drawing us to a particular case. It's just something that's interesting. And eventually we'll be able to articulate it, but not kind of at the beginning. So that's one of the big hallmarks, I think, of this dirtbagging approach. The other one is the way in which it really requires flexibility. So again, you have to perfect your research design by the end. So you do have a research design. It does have to be vetted. It does have to be cleaned up. But it's something that you do kind of in the process, not before you go out into the field, but while you're in the field, after you withdraw from the field, and so on. So some kind of aspects of this more flexible kind of research design in process is you usually have to come up with the justification for your case after you've already selected your case. So again, that kind of idea of it's just an interesting case. So you can't publish, you can't get published and say it's just an interesting case. You have to justify it. But a lot of times for the type of research that I'm talking about, a lot of times that case selection doesn't actually matter, at least not in the conventional sense. It's the type of thing that basically you can study anywhere. So like you can study, for example, unhoused people probably in any medium or kind of major city. And it doesn't really matter which city you choose. And you can go through the exercise of explaining why it's a good city to study this. But at the end of the day, you can study it in a lot of different places. And especially if you're interested in kind of more conceptual issues, like say resistance or something, then again, like the like empirical specifics of your case actually don't matter as much as kind of the broader information. So this brings me to the next point, which is a lot of times people's concerns about external validity or basically generalizability are overstated for this type of project, because a lot of times people are worried about the empirical details, like what are the demographics of your study of unhoused people, and does that match, does the unhoused population that you're studying in San Diego match what it is in Toronto, Canada? Very unlikely. It probably isn't. But at the end of the day, are your kind of broader kind of takeaways from your study going to be probably fairly generalizable across those two very different settings? Probably. Like some of the, the nitty gritty details, like survival strategies, there's going to be some overlap and some difference. So basically you can think of these as considerations that you have to address, you have to keep in mind, but they're usually not kind of like a death sentence for your study. And then finally, I just want to make a caveat. So I'm talking about flexibility, kind of concerns are overstated. One way in which we can't be flexible is with sampling. Sampling always matters. We always want to be aware of our limitations, and that's true for every project, but especially when it comes to sampling. We want to be really careful with that. And there are tricks that you can use for kind of checking your sampling, like collecting more data, triangulating, thinking about alternative explanations, working through counterfactuals, and so on. But we have to be really careful about our sampling. Everything else is pretty flexible. Whoops, sorry, lost my slides. There we go. Oh, why is this? Oh no. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so the final thing I want to say, I think is a really important point, which is we always have to think about what is our project goals, and then adjust our research process to that. So basically, if you have a narrow research question, you're not a dirtbagger, and you don't want to try to adopt the dirtbagger kind of approach. You want to stick to the kind of the right way. So your narrow research question, you're going to do the kind of conventional canonical approach. You need a rigid research design. You finalize that before you go into the field. So again, you're, literature-driven research. You're probably looking at the relationship between two variables. You might even be doing a hypothesis testing. And if that's the case, there are very specific rules for case selection that you have to follow. And so you really want your research design to be perfected before you collect your data and before you analyze your data. Okay. Now, if you're doing this kind of more dirtbagger style where you have this broad research question, there you have to follow a flexible research design that you're kind of constantly developing and tweaking your research design as you go and perfecting it by the end. So again, this is that interest-driven approach to research. You're kind of going out and seeing what the data show. You're not setting out to test hypotheses, even if you do eventually add in some hypothesis testing to kind of check some things at the end. And it's totally okay to do legitimate cases. This approach a lot of times takes longer because it's less linear. It can be a little bit more anxiety producing because you don't really know what you're going to get in a way that's like even more true than with other types of research, where you might be like, at the 80th percentile point of your research in terms of like how long the project is taking, and you're like, I figured out what my project is about. That's really anxiety producing and doesn't lend itself well to, say, grant-based research or writing a paper in this length of a semester or something like that. But that's kind of the approach you need for this type of research question and that type of research. But very importantly, you cannot mix and match. One of the kind of horrifying things of having my book out is people say, I'm a dirtbagger, I love this. But basically they're reading it as, you're letting me off the hook for doing certain things that I just don't like to do. But the project that they're setting out to do is very much a conventional project where they need to follow those really annoying rules that you have to, perfect before you go out and collect your data. So it's very important to kind of identify what type of project you're doing and then adjust your research approach to that project and be careful about that. Okay, so to conclude, I just want to emphasize, not everyone's a dirtbagger, and that's okay. Not everyone should follow the dirtbagging approach. For some projects, as I just emphasized, that would just lead to a disaster. So we definitely don't want everybody to be a dirtbagger. But that said, everyone can follow the dirtbagger ethos. So I think it's important to kind of embrace methodological pluralism, recognizing that there are multiple right ways. There are wrong ways. There are wrong things to do when it comes to research, but there are multiple right ways, and that's okay. Recognize that we don't have to be rigid to be rigorous. Recognize that there are different approaches, and those different approaches let you do different things, and that's beautiful. We don't all have to do the same approach that we were trained to do, or that one person prefers over another. And as part of that, we need to be supportive of each other. So when somebody has a project where it's like, oh wow, that's really interesting, I have no idea how you're going to do it, instead of saying like, oh, that's a terrible project, don't do it. Instead, what we should be doing is helping each other figure out how to do those projects. Okay, so that is it. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Ashley, thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. I'm going to try to switch. See, go to structure view. Let's see if I can find a chat. So if anyone online has a question, feel free to put it in the chat, or you can reveal yourself and just ask it directly. If anyone here has a question, I'm happy to, you can ask it. I can repeat it for the people online. I have a question. Maybe I'm going to ask this on behalf of the graduate students. So something that has come up, I guess, in class repeatedly is people saying, things like, "Oh, this sounds great. I want to do. I want to be a dirtbagger. I think I'm naturally a dirtbagger." But my advisor has other ideas for me in my project, right? Like my advisor is working in this very conventional way and wants like a 2-variable question and generalizability of the cases or these specific cases in mind already. Like, what do you tell students who are kind of dealing with that as a constraint?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Thank you. And thank you to the students who bring this up as well. So my advice is, unfortunately, listen to your advisor. Because that or switch your advisor, but that's a lot harder to do and can just be very chaotic. So basically my advice is, at the end of the day, the person signing off on your dissertation is your advisor and your dissertation committee, and you have to please them. And so that means coming up with the research question that they want you to do. I don't want people to go rogue, because I don't want to say like, no, like be a dirtbagger at heart and you'll be fine. Because you might get people who don't understand, and if your advisor isn't that way, so this would be really self-serving, but I could say like, slip them a copy of my book. But like at the end of the day, it takes a lot for people to change their mind and to be open about that. Sometimes it's subfield differences, and so sometimes you have to find like the subfield that fits you. So a lot of interdisciplinary spaces are a lot more friendly to this kind of flexible approach. But you also have to think about like the job market. So especially for grad students, depending on what your goals are, sometimes, like, for example, I would not recommend doing a dirtbagging approach for your job talk. Like if it's, all done and all said, like everything's great, like then that's wonderful. But if you're doing kind of a more kind of in progress approach, then not necessarily. So I think it's a good idea to have like certain kind of more canonical projects to have like, in your back pocket. So this is basically what I had to do in grad school. So my first 2 papers were very much canonical approaches. Actually, my first 2 papers were quantitative. And eventually my dissertation was qualitative, but I did not present that for my job talk, because I was interviewing at a very quantitative department. And if I had presented my qualitative research, I wouldn't have gotten the job. Now, this was, like 10 plus years ago. Things have changed, and it also depends on what field you're going to. So hopefully, that's better. But at the end of the day, I would say be practical. And I also encourage side projects. So that's kind of what got me through grad school, is having those side projects that kept me sane, where, here's the project that people want me to do. And here's the project that I want to do. There's a technical term, I forget what industry it comes from, but it's called skunk works. And it's the project you're not supposed to be working on, but it's kind of like your dessert at the end of the day, the fun thing that kind of gets you through while you like do the stuff for your advisor or for, getting the job or, whatever that is. That's my advice. And the same thing goes for like semester length projects. It's really hard to be a dirtbagger and get a paper done in a semester for a class where, the first 2 weeks you turn in your lit review and the second 2 weeks you do your research design, because a lot of times the research design you're doing is going to be perfected by the end. And so that doesn't work. So one of the things I'm hoping to do is kind of give advice to faculty as well about how we can be more supportive of dirtbagging students. But in the meantime, until that flexibility is there, at the end of the day, like, your goal is to graduate. So, do what you have to do to graduate. And I'm sorry, I don't have like better advice, but basically my first goal is do no harm. And so that's my my response and my way of doing no harm. I hope that helps.
I think that sounds really reasonable. Know your audience too.
Yeah.
There's some questions in the Q&A. I don't know if you can see them. The first one is,
Yeah.
does the dirtbagger approach mean that we can change the research methodology during any time or stage of our research?
Yeah, great question. So again, assuming you're doing this broad research question, then yeah. So you go out into the field. So let's say you're doing, I'm going to use archives as an example because this is my favorite. You go to the archive and you have your list of data sets that you're going to look at, your collections, as they call them in archives. And you're like, oh man, this is going to be great. I have this collection, this collection, this collection. I'm going to have so many insights about how things worked in this particular, say, organization. Then you get there and you see the actual data you have access to, and it's really thin. And you're like, oh no. So this, this whole research trip, it's not, it's not a waste. It's about 10% of what I thought I was going to get. Like I thought my project would be almost done after this, but it turns out I need to go to a couple more archives. I need to look at a whole bunch more collections. I need to think about like what else I can collect, what other insights I can get to figure this out. And so like that's a situation where you have to change your research design. If you stick to your research design and just say like, okay, well, I did what I said I was going to do, that would be a bad project because your research design is insufficient once you actually see your data. So another one is I'm a big advocate of kind of constantly checking your kind of insights and thinking about like the worst case scenario. What if I'm wrong? What if there's an alternative explanation out there? And this is really big in political science. So I'm drawing a lot on them for this. So like thinking about alternative explanation. So, workshop your project with people. People love to try to explain your project to you, which is always so fun, being totally sarcastic here. So people will say like, oh, this is probably what's going on, or that's probably what's going on. Keep a list of those suggestions and then collect data and see like, so even if you're like, oh no, that's like, I know my data, that's not what's going on. Go through and systematically collect data on those things. So for example, one that came up in my dissertation research was people were like, oh, the building was so expensive for this prison. That's why they never changed their approach to incarceration. And so I went out and I was like, okay, is that the case? And so I looked at all the financial information. I looked at the architectural history. I looked at other prisons where they also adopted this model and kind of looked at how, to what extent they were also constrained by the architecture and the expense. And it turns out, no, that wasn't an issue. So the more you can collect that other data is really useful. And that's another way of kind of tweaking your research project. One thing that I do warn about is, especially when you're working with live human subjects, so especially for interviews, if you're trying to do kind of a more conventional approach, or you're trying to like really tease out the relationship between two variables, if you change your interview guide midway through your interviews, you start to potentially introduce bias in your project. So let's say you have 40 interviews, and after 10 interviews, you start asking people about a different question. And that wasn't in your initial interviews. Like it comes out of the initial interviews, but the way you're asking it is different. So if you're trying to do something where you're interested in like how answers to a particular question vary by demographic group or experience or something like that, then basically your first 10 interviews aren't going to help you with that. And so you want to be just mindful of that. So it doesn't mean you have to throw those out. If you can go back and re-interview people, and that's not going to like, bias the process or something, like if sometimes there's certain types of questions where you want to ask them at the end. And so if you've already asked that question, then like, well, I can't really go back and re-interview them and have it be like a fresh sample. Maybe you decide I'm going to interview 10 more people than I was expecting. I was going to do 40 and I'm going to do 50. Like that would be okay and advisable. But just basically think about what are the changes that you're doing, introducing? Are they going to introduce any sort of bias or new limitations? Are they like another one that comes up when you're analyzing your data is you start realizing, oh, this variable is actually really important. You always want to go back and reanalyze your earlier data to make sure that you also are looking at for how that variable plays out in those situations too, in case there's some sort of like bias that you're introducing in your analysis process. So short answer, yes, totally okay to change your research design. Just always be mindful about what that change is going to do and what type of approach you're doing. So broad research question, probably totally fine. Narrow research question, proceed with caution. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks. Are there any questions from the in-person crowd, Lee?
Yeah, that was a great talk. I am interested in, and I know the next book is going to address this, but how you write about the process, or is right articles, particularly for articles. I think in books there's a lot more room to sort of take your readers on a journey, but in an article form, you kind of just, it's laid out in a linear format. So I'm interested in how maybe it's a teaser for your next book, if you could just share that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. Thank you. So, so there are a couple of advices. One is like literally how do you do it, like the writing portion, and then the other one is like what should it look like in the end. So the how do you do it, I always recommend for everything. I'm a big fan of memos. So as you're doing your data collection, or like as you're kind of mapping out your research design, write yourself a memo and justify everything. And it can be like super expansive, but every detail. And like really, you don't want to leave anything out, because 6 months later you go back and you're like, wait, did I check that website when I was collecting my data? Like, why did I do this, this thing or something? Just like always justify everything. And then you keep writing memos, or you can kind of adjust the original one with like edits. I like to timestamp my edits so I know like what was original and what was not. So I have like really clear records. But basically just document everything as you go. And then as you start to actually write it up, you can draw from those memos. So this is one of the things I love about memos, is you're never dealing with a blank document or a blank page when you actually start to write things up, because you just copy and paste things out of your memos, or you can outline and then kind of plug things in from your memos and so on. So memos are really helpful for like the technical part of literally writing things up. But in terms of like, what do you say and how honest are you? It's really interesting, because like this is going to sound bad, but like you don't have to be as honest as sometimes people think they have to be about their methods. So like you don't want to lie, just want to start there. Like don't lie about your methods, but you don't have to walk people through the journey of how you did everything. So basically that finalized research design, that's what you're going to write about. If there's something that you changed along the way that like is going to impact your data collection or your data analysis, you want to write that up too. So you want to be clear about like, here's what I did. But you don't have to say like, well, I started off and I was going to study the unhoused population in LA, and I wanted to look at their economic survival strategies. So here I'm parodying Forrest Stewart in his fantastic book, Down and Out on Skid Row. And so he set out to study people's survival strategies. So, but once he got there, or their economic survival strategies specifically, once he got there, he realized policing is far more important, and it would be almost dishonest if he didn't study the way that policing shaped people's lives. And so he pivoted his research project. If I were writing that up for an article, I wouldn't give the history of I selected LA because Skid Row and economic survival strategies and all that. And so I, did my sample because I'm going to adjust my sample based on, okay, I need to look at the policing stuff. So I'm going to shift things. I have to think about, does LA and policing make sense for LA policing on unhoused people? Yeah, that makes sense. So justify that. So basically you're going to tell them kind of the final version rather than all of the like false starts, or unless it's really relevant to your process. So like sometimes data collection goes on for 3 years, and the first bit is we did these interviews, but then the pandemic started and I had to shift to Zoom. I think that's something that you would want to say, because it affects your data collection process, and kind of it's going to introduce a change in what your data looks like and explains why you did that. It wasn't something that you chose to do, it was something you had to do. So so basically the kind of upshot then is give people the final research design, not the like tour of all the ins and outs of all the changes you had to make, unless it affects your data collection. I think that's the best way to explain it. So but in general, I would say a lot of times I see people not including enough information about their methods. So you want to always hit the high points, and you can basically have like a little a checklist of like, okay, so how did I select my case? Why is this a good case? And this is another one where you don't have to be honest. If you literally chose your case because it was just interesting to you, don't put that in the paper. That can be your private reason for doing it. But not like, you still have to have like an official justification for why your case makes sense. Even if it's, at the end of the day, this is something I could study anywhere. But here are some kind of additional points about why this is a good city to study, or good place or organization or whatever to study. So why your case, what kind of data collection methods you used, your sample or samples. A lot of times we have multiple samples. Just all those kind of nitty gritty pieces of if somebody wanted to replicate your study, even if, like we don't really do that these days, but just imagine if somebody wanted to replicate your study, what steps would they need to know to replicate it, which again is going to be the final research design, not necessarily like, the windy road that took you to get to the final product. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I would take your methods class, I think. Yeah. There's a question. Sarah, was there a hand up there? We could go to Mai's question online. How have you dealt with the pressure to identify external validity while pursuing grants and justifying the dirtbagger approach?
Yeah, wonderful question. So the external validity hasn't come up so much on grants, and I should do full disclosure. A lot of my grants, I've not done a lot of grants, so I can't even say a lot of my grants. The grants that I've done have mostly been for history and for interdisciplinary spaces. I've drafted so many NSF law and social science proposals, but I never finished them up. I always felt very dishonest, and I just did not like the process. And at the end of the day, I'm not supposed to say this, but my research doesn't actually need money to fund, as long as I can find time to do my research. And I'm pretty good at that, and I'm fortunate. I don't have things taking up my time that a lot of other people do, so I'm able to make time for my research. So I don't have to like buy out my time to do research. So because of that, I don't really need grants. So it's except for like a couple of small grants that I got from various historical societies to go to archives and things like that. But in terms of kind of thinking about external validity, this is one where I think kind of reminding people what the point of certain types of qualitative methods is, and like what they're really good for, what they shine at, is really helpful. So a lot of times we just have to kind of educate people about what it is that qualitative methods do, or at least some types of qualitative methods, because big tent, a lot of different types of qualitative methods. So if people are pushing back on external generalizability, remind people about the distinction between empirical and theoretical generalizability. So just because the empirical details of your case are different from another place doesn't mean that your study is not generalizable. It's theoretically generalizable. And you can, think critically about like, to what extent is this true for your particular project? Because it's not always going to be true. And so you have to like think through that. But just to kind of illustrate what I mean, I can study prisoner resistance in 19th century Pennsylvania in an incredibly unique prison, or I could study it in contemporary Norway with a very different prison population, a very different type of prison, very different type of society, and very different time period. But at the end of the day, there's some really interesting similarities that we'll see across these two different spaces. And that's the theoretical generalizability. And a lot of times that's actually the stuff that's like more prestigious in a lot of cases. So in policy circles, not so much. People really want to know about the empirical generalizability. But when it comes to academic circles, the theoretical stuff, the more we can kind of bump up the level of generalizability and talk about things that are kind of true across really different type of cases. So for example, I love Ji-Young Lee's book, Blowing Up, where he's studying rap artists, aspiring rap artists. And he likens them as part of the framing of the book. He likens them to ballerinas, baseball players, mathematicians. I think I'm forgetting a group, but basically he ends up with these really disparate types of groups. But at the end of the day, they all kind of face the same kind of big pressure. So obviously, like the nitty gritty pressures of like a physical sport, like say baseball or ballerinas, is going to be different from the kind of more mental and performative pressures of aspiring rap stars. But the kind of pressure to make it big by an early age, because all of these groups kind of have age restrictions in terms of like when they have to make it big before it's probably not going to happen. That's what they have in common. So finding that common ground of kind of pointing to similar but different cases, that's where this type of work really shines. And that's where we can kind of make a bigger impact, especially theoretically, and kind of show people what things have in common that we might not otherwise have thought about. Like, I never would have thought of like the combination of those four groups, for example. So that's for the external generalizability. And then let's see, and justifying the dirtbagging approach. Just kind of preempting the kind of standard criticisms that people get. So I've kind of written about the various common ones that you get in the book, like people have concerns about sample size. We've talked about external generalizability. There are a couple more that I'm now blanking on, but basically going through kind of have this checklist in your mind of like, okay, here are the things that people want. A lot of times people want us to quantify our results. And it's like, with an interview size of say 30 interviews, it doesn't make sense to quantify my results. That would be misleading. Or sometimes we're dealing with like archival methods. So one time for a journal article I was doing, somebody wanted me to quantify the number of instances of resistance I saw in my data. And I had to explain, and I put this in a footnote so it would be in the article. Basically, the nature of archival research is we don't know like how systematic it is. It's not going to be a perfect window into the world. And that's usually the case with a lot of our data. They're never perfect windows into the world. And we have to be really cognizant of that. So if I were to go ahead and quantify that, I would have no way of saying like, yeah, this is, you know, a good estimate of how many are. It's the tip of the iceberg. I have no idea. It's probably way more than that. So if I quantify it, it gives people false confidence. And so I don't want to do that. And so kind of going through those various explanations about why we're doing things the way we are, keeping in mind that people a lot of times are coming from either quantitative approaches or from kind of more buttoned up type of qualitative research where some of the quantitative steps actually do make a lot of sense, like that hypothesis testing stuff. So just kind of anticipating those, I think, is another good thing to do when it comes to both publishing and also for grant research. I hope that helps.
Yeah, and I would just say, speaking to Carol Colfer's comment, that it's the usual way of doing ethnographic research. It's true. And I think where your book really fills a real need and a niche is for qualitative researchers who are in a discipline or a department where they're the minority, right? Like probably not anthropologists, where the standard is everybody's going to do kind of messy ethnography and has always been doing this and thinks this way. But for sociologists, right, political scientists, you know, anyone on the line of economics for sure, right? It's like you're constantly faced with this criticism or the assumption that your qualitative methods have to look like the quantitative ones. So I see like that's so valuable. I mean, your contribution is so valuable. There's a question from Maria.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It's really I wanted to, what would be the advice that you will tell for like a young researcher that's just starting? Because this is very useful, but sometimes we have this imposter syndrome, no? Or like we need some kind of compass to guide our research, and also to ensure that we're having some progress in time and we are not just making circles. Like any advice how we can deal with it using this approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think the question was about kind of imposter syndrome and advice for kind of building up confidence and stuff. Thank you. So yeah, so it's so true. I would say one of the things that was really helpful for me was like getting a bunch of small wins over time, and that really helped to build my confidence. And a lot of that actually happened my first year on the tenure track, where it was kind of like, okay, like I can see what I can do now. This is great. Some of it just takes time, so just trust that you will get there. And then the other part of it is like, there will always be a little bit of imposter syndrome. I just became editor of a journal, and like, I am not joking. I have massive imposter syndrome for doing this. So like, you know, some of it goes away, but like, we also just continuously grow. And so a lot of the stuff that you're nervous about in grad school, you'll be like totally a pro by the end of grad school. And certainly by the time you're done with grad school. But we also kind of get to new vistas. And then, so like that happens again. So this is another way of also saying like coming up with strategies now is really good. So excellent question on that front. So yeah, so I think the best thing I can suggest is trying to find small wins. So kind of breaking off and chewing like small projects. So easy to do projects. So I think it's a good idea to start with conventional projects. And this is actually my advice to people teaching qualitative methods is like, it's totally fine to start with the conventional approach, as long as you explain like, this is not the only way to do things, in part because you kind of need to know the rules before you can start to break them or kind of play with them and get creative. So starting off and like getting a quick and easy publication out based on kind of a conventional approach. Like, you know, you go out, you come up with a research question based on the literature. So I think one of the most important things in grad school is learning, you know, the literature, whatever it is in your field, and kind of thinking about like, if I were to put together a syllabus and I were to teach a class on my field, like what would that look like? So learning that literature and then getting to the point where you can start to identify research questions that are going to be interesting to other people in your field. That's a really great skill. And so like the more you can do that, I think is really good. And then like from there, you can start to come up with like fairly easy to do, like I say easy to do now, but like, I mean, they're always a challenge the first time you do it. And that's the other thing to remember is everything's a challenge the first time you do it. So it's always going to get easier after that. But basically break off a fairly easy kind of doable project and, you know, perfect it and then send it out. I guess I shouldn't say perfect because people can be perfectionists. So, you know, do a really good job and then send it out. And try to get it published, and then move on to something more advanced where you have that kind of easy win under your belt. And then you just kind of start working your way up. The other thing I think is really good, kind of not just thinking in terms of publications, but basically attend as many research talks as you can and just absorb and kind of see how people are interacting. This is part of what we call the socialization of grad school. You're kind of learning how to interact, how to ask questions. You'll sometimes see like senior grad students and they'll just be like, oh my God, I remember when I was in grad school, I was so impressed by like my senior colleagues and just thinking like, oh my God, they're so smart. Like I'm never gonna get there. And then eventually you do get there. It just takes time and that kind of practice. And a lot of that early practice is kind of seeing other people do it. If you have a seminar you can go to where some faculty will have classes where like you exchange papers and you practice commenting on people's papers, or you can create your own writing group and just practice giving people feedback. That's really helpful, both for improving your own research, but also in terms of like figuring out how do you actually help to improve other people's research. And so basically just practicing, you can have projects where you like write them up and they might never get published, and that's okay. It's good practice. And so just kind of seeing everything as a learning opportunity, a chance to practice, and then kind of absorbing what you learn from this. And I also, again, I encourage taking memos, like basically take notes on like what works, what doesn't. I'm a big fan of what I call algorithms, kind of rules to live by. So like, what are some things of like, here's how to do this thing. So once you figure out what works, write it down because you won't always remember. So things like that I think are really helpful. And then just over time, you get more confident, you get more experience. And eventually a lot of that imposter syndrome goes away. But, you know, just remember, like you got into grad school, you belong here. And so now it's just you letting yourself, you know, thrive and figuring out what you need to do to be successful. And there are a lot of really good books on that. So I'll also plug a recent book by Jess Calarco called A Field Guide to Grad School, and it's all about the hidden curriculum. And that can also be a major kind of boost, confidence boost, because some of what's intimidating is people say things that we don't understand because they're using weird jargon terms. They're coming from a different discipline. We're just unfamiliar with it. And so kind of reading books like that can be really helpful for kind of filling in some of the gaps that, you know, we'll eventually figure out, but it's going to take time if somebody just doesn't like sit us down and explain how all this works. And no one ever like remembers everything to explain to people. So, so it's a great book for doing that. So great question.
It's a great set of recommendations. Any other questions from the room? Nothing? There was one kind of follow-up question. I don't know if you feel like you answered it yet or not. What are the factors we must keep in mind when we change the research methodology?
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So take notes. I'm a broken record on taking memos and taking notes. And thinking about what limitations we've introduced. So what is it that if we've changed something, coming back to the purpose of our research project. So, you know, again, if you're in the world where you're like testing hypotheses and you need to make comparisons, like especially comparative research is like this, where if we've changed something and now we've introduced a new thing that's changing kind of our original comparison. So let's say, you know, originally we were studying these two sites and they're perfectly selected because they have all these like variables that they match on or something like that. And they're different on, you know, other important variables. So they're perfectly selected, but then something happens and we have to choose a different site. So we have the like one of the two original sites, but then we have a third one. And it like has some of the variables that we wanted, but not all of them. So think about like, are there ways that we can address it? So my kind of global advice is always be aware of our limitations and then take steps to address it. So like the number one thing I think is important for all studies is to address your limitations, like acknowledge them, that they exist. And just because limitations exist doesn't mean your study is a disaster, because every study has limitations. So address or acknowledge what those limitations are, take steps to mitigate any challenges they might pose if that's possible. And then kind of say what you think might be the consequences of any limitations you're not able to address. And for me, that's the recipe for success. Like, we can't have a completely terrible study that just has a bunch of limitations. We're like, oh, well, sorry, that's just the way it is. But if we take steps to address them, then I think that's good to do. And I think we can think about that really for every stage of our research. So, maybe we change our research question in the middle and we decide, maybe my case actually isn't the best one for this research question. So now I have to decide, do I want to change my case? Do I want to change my research question? What if I introduce a different case and I have both cases? Is that feasible given my resources? So just basically thinking through critically about all those steps, depending on, what stage of your research design you're talking about. Are you talking about the case? Are you talking about your sample or samples? I think one of the kind of ways to fix a lot of our projects is we can always go out and collect more data. It's going to take longer. It might not fit our original timeline, but like we can always do it. And here's kind of a pro tip. So especially if you're at like the dissertation phase and you're on the job market, it's very common for people to get, well, it used to be more common. It's now with this job market, maybe not, but it does happen where people get a job before their dissertation is done. And so one good kind of trick you can follow is to have a dissertation where you can kind of break it in half and say, okay, as long as I get to this minimum work product, then I'm good. And then like, if I have more time, excellent. But if not, maybe that's something I do when I'm faculty or when I'm doing my postdoc or whatever it is, but I have that minimum product where it's like, yeah, that's a dissertation. That's a good thing to do. And so kind of setting up your research. So like, maybe you have two cases and you're like, I'll do the second case later. So then in that case, start with the most important case. So things like that, I would say, just to kind of think about what's practical, think about what are some pitfalls that might befall you. And then just to always take notes and just be very conscientious and reflective the entire time. Whoops. I think that's a good thing to do.
The minimum viable product advice, which I love and live by. Yeah.
Hashtag Scrum.
Yes, exactly. Anything else from here? Cool. We'll wrap up and let you go. Enjoy your day out there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. This was really a pleasure to have you, and really excellent talk and such a wonderful book. I would say if anyone hasn't read it, pick it up. It is really, really useful. And yeah, we could give you another round of applause.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you for the wonderful questions. And thank you for attending. This has really been awesome.
Yeah, great. Next time we'll get you to Cornell. It's only
I've been to upstate New York, but I've never been to Ithaca, right? Yeah, I've never been to Ithaca, and I would love to visit.
Yeah, it's about the opposite of where you are right now.
I miss the snow, honestly.
It's a real snow day here.
Nice.
Anyway, thanks again, Ashley.
Yeah, thank you so much for hosting and inviting me.
Yeah, thank you.
Take care. Bye.